Today I'll be reviewing the Nikon D7100. Now, this is not a brand new camera. Well, this current camera is brand new, but the camera itself has been on the market since about April of 2013. I'm recording this review in January of 2014, so this is not a review of the latest and greatest piece of equipment to hit the market, but it's a camera that I've been shooting with for a little while, and I'm going to give you my thoughts and impressions of it, as well as what it was like to upgrade from this camera, the D200. This came out in, I think, 2005. I've been using this for a couple of years. It's an awesome camera. But I'm going to be talking about why I upgraded and why I chose this particular model, the D7100, and what this might have to do with your current photographic situation, what camera you're shooting with, or what your photographic needs are. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my background and why I chose this versus a full-frame model, and some things about the D7100 that you might find useful. Now, there's a ton of reviews out there. The Art of Photography has a good review. Jared Polin has a good review. B&H has good reviews. I mean, if you go to YouTube, you'll find dozens of reviews of this camera. As well as a lot of photographic comparisons. If you go to DP Review, they have all kinds of photographic comparisons that I can't do because they have a controlled lighting situation and a really precise setup to compare this to every other camera in the market. So if you're a pixel peeper interested in the finest technical details, this is not the review for you. But if you're an enthusiast photographer who just likes to take good photos and is looking to upgrade or looking for information about this camera, that's what this is for. So a little bit of background. I started shooting with a DSLR about 2 years ago with this Nikon D200. Sorry, I have to keep leaning over to pick it up here. Using this D200 forced me to learn about photography and understand what my needs are as a photographer. You'll notice there's a prime lens on here. This is a 50mm prime. The 7100 has my 35mm prime. I came to realize that primes were ideal for me as a photographer. They're not ideal for everyone, but they worked well for me. The D200 is not well suited for auto shooters. If you just like to shoot everything in auto, it does have a program auto mode, but really it was designed to meet the needs of more demanding crop sensor camera users back when it came out in 2005. And as such, it's got a lot of features that are oriented more towards professional photographers. I don't consider myself a professional, but I appreciated that having this camera forced me to think beyond just using auto. I shoot a lot of people and a lot of nature. I don't shoot a lot of landscapes, and I shoot a lot of family-style photo sessions, not necessarily family portraits, like official studio lit portraits, but I shoot a lot of pictures of people as well as pictures of my own kids. My primary reason for upgrading cameras was the ISO performance on this 200 is not as good as I wish it were. It's really good at 100, 200, even 400. When you hit 800, it gets a little grainy, and beyond that, it's pretty bad. The max ISO is 1600, and I wouldn't recommend it. You can remove a lot of that noise in Lightroom, but still, it's the information that you get, the color information is not as good as 1600. And beyond that, at high 1, it goes to 3200, but it's not very good. So I really like this camera, and I recommend it to anyone who's looking to get into photography because it's such a quality piece of equipment. And you can buy it used. I picked up mine used for $450. That was 2 years ago. You can probably find it for $250, $300. It's awesome. I mean, it's a fantastic camera for someone who's just getting into photography. But I outgrew it, and I wanted to get a better camera. My primary reason for upgrading was the ISO. My secondary reasons were I wanted a bigger screen on the back. This screen is not very big. I wanted more versatility with the camera. I wanted more room to crop in post, and some other reasons too, which I'll get into. So in terms of upgrading, as most of you know, there's generally a couple different paths you can take. You can go mirrorless if you want to go with like an Olympus OMD EM1 or a Sony NEX7. Those are good choices. You can go full frame, which is a little more expensive, and you'll get much better image quality. There's a lot of different things you can do. Ultimately, it depends on your needs as a photographer. No one can tell you what the best solution is. It all depends on what do you need and what will suit you best. For me, my primary consideration was low light photography, and I find myself in situations a lot where I wish I could bump the ISO on this up to 3200 or even 6400 and still get good images, and it's not going to happen on this 200. but that was my consideration. Your mileage may vary. Also, your budget. If you're looking to upgrade to full frame, you're talking a lot of money. And if you're not shooting professionally, if you're not making income off of your camera, maybe full frame is not the way to go. But again, I mean, your needs are different, and everyone's mileage may vary. Crop sensor cameras today, though, are outstanding compared to a few years ago, and they will probably meet a crop sensor camera, whether it's a Micro Four Thirds or a APS-C like in these, will probably meet your needs unless you're a dedicated professional shooter, in which case full frame is probably the answer, or even medium format. If you make your living from your camera, full frame is probably the way to go. The crop just can't match the rich color tones and dynamic range of full frame, not to mention the high ISO performance. But for me, I was looking at a full frame, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I ultimately decided that I didn't really need that. I was strongly considering the used D700. I was familiar with his body style. The D300S is a good model. I've used that before, several times actually, and I like that. The D700 is the same body style. It's a little bigger, but D700 shooters really like their D700s, and for good reason. It's still a good camera. It came out in 2008. It's still a great camera today. It's a full frame 12 megapixel camera. Used is about $1,500, give or take, depending on where you look, and the condition of the camera. So it's a little more expensive, but it's a good camera, and it's a full frame, and you get all the benefits of full frame. I was also looking at a D610, not a D600, because of the issue with dust and oil in the sensor. But the D610, if you look at the DxO Mark scores and stuff like that, you'll find out that it's got one of the best sensors available. I mean, period. One of the best digital SLR sensors you can buy on the D610. And the high ISO performance of that is awesome. I mean, it's through the roof. It's $2,000 for the D610, and I didn't know if I was ready to spend that much. But so I looked at all these, and I looked at the features of the cameras and what I needed, and I ultimately decided, though, that I was going to ditch this 200, keep it around, it's a backup body now, and get the D7100. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why that D7100. First of all, the performance of this, it's not a full frame, it's a crop sensor, but it's pretty close to the D700. Now, it's not the same. So D700 owners, you don't fill the comment section with talk about how it's not as good. I know it's not as good, but it's close, especially for not professional shooters, but for enthusiast shooters like myself. It's the performance of this, especially in low light, is close to the D700. If you're bumping up to 6400 ISO, you're going to see some noise and grain in here that you might not see in a 700. So that is going to give you the benefits of higher ISO performance. But I decided that this was good enough for me. This is also cheaper than both a used D700 and a new or even a used D610. And I decided that I could buy this camera for $1,100, or maybe I paid $1,050, I don't remember, and spend that extra money the extra $500 or $1,000 on lenses. Again, that's what I decided. You're going to decide different depending on your needs. I also really like that this the AF system, the autofocus system on this camera, is the same one they use in the D4, the professional full frame camera. And the AF system on the D610, despite the really good image sensor of the D610, the AF system is not as good. It's a 39 point, there's 39 AF points, and they're all clustered in the center. It's a little slower than this one. And so this one, they cover almost the entire frame, especially if you're in the 1.3 crop mode on here. I realized that I like a lot of the features of this that the D700 just didn't have. And I'll get to some of those later in the review. So even though the higher ISO performance isn't quite as good as the D700 and not nearly as good as the D610, it met my needs. And you need to consider your needs as well. This is plenty good enough for me and will last me many years to come. And there's other advantages of this that come into play besides just higher ISO performance. So now let's get to the review itself and talk about some of the specifics of this camera. some of this will be compared to the D200. That's just my situation. Build quality. This was a concern for me because I really like the tank feel, the rock feel of my D200. That thing could take a beating, and it's all magnesium alloy body. This is not. This is magnesium back and top. So the front is actually composed of a hard plastic material, the same as the lower end consumer cameras. And so originally I thought, man, that's not really my cup of tea. But when I picked one up and held it, it's a solid machine. It's a solid camera. It's not quite as good as the D200 or the 300 or the 700, but it's close. You can tell a difference if you pick them up. But man, I have no issues with this camera, the build quality. It's hefty, but it's not heavy. And if you hold this versus a 200 or 300 or 700, you can tell the difference. It's a little lighter, but it's durable. You're not going to break this camera. So build quality, even though it wasn't quite as good as the others, it's plenty good enough for me, and plenty good enough for probably any casual or enthusiast shooter out there. Unless you're just like beating this on the hiking trail every day, I think you'll be fine. It's also good. It has weather sealing. And according to Nikon, it's as good as the D800 weather sealing. So you can take it out in the rain and still shoot with it. So there's, again, some good advantages to this camera. Image quality, it's outstanding. And that's probably the most important consideration. Those 24 megapixels is a lot, but it gives you a lot of room to crop. I shoot in RAW, and my RAW files are anywhere from 30 to 45 megabytes, depending on if I'm using compression or not in 14-bit RAW. But they're extremely sharp, and there's outstanding color rendition. The out-of-camera results on this are awesome, especially compared to the D200. And you can sit and compare this to other cameras all day long, and you can zoom in. You can zoom in 1:1, 100%, and look at, well, this blade of grass isn't maybe quite as sharp as on the Pentax K3, or it's this tree. There's a little chromatic aberration in the leaves of this tree versus the Canon 70D and things like that. But I mean, really, to be honest, the image quality that you get on this is outstanding. You're not going to buy this camera and suddenly be regretting it because your images look like they look terrible. The image quality on this, though, is actually about the same as the lower end D5200. They both use similar chips. I think this chip, the image sensor, might be made by Toshiba versus that one's made by Sony. But honestly, this is an outstanding camera for straight up image quality. Great dynamic range, especially at higher or lower ISOs. If you buy this and your images are not what you want them to be, chances are it's not the camera's fault. I'll just leave it at that. But you know, to be honest, almost any digital SLR or mirrorless camera or any camera you buy today, unless it's a little point and shoot, if your photos aren't as good as you want, probably isn't the camera's fault, regardless of what you buy. So you can compare this. You can compare the DxOMark scores from this to any other camera, and maybe this has a slightly higher. This is like an 82. The Canon might be rated a 78 or whatever. Honestly, you're going to be fine with pretty much any camera you buy. But if you really do care about image quality, and if you're a pixel peeper, this is one of the best crop sensor cameras you can buy in terms of straight up image quality. Bested maybe only by the Pentax K3, which just recently came out. Let's see. I'm looking at my notes here on the screen, so pardon me for looking down like this all the time. Let's talk about high ISO performance. This is outstanding for a crop sensor camera. I had to add that caveat here. Especially compared to the D200. I mean, it's not even fair. It's ridiculous how much better it is. You can get... results on this are perfectly fine at 3200, and you might, again, you can zoom into 100% and see a little noise here and a little grain there, and if you underexpose by 3 stops and then boost it up in Lightroom, you'll see some banding in the dark areas. I mean, come on, how often do people really do that? If your exposure is good in the camera, your images are going to be awesome at 3200 ISO. Even at 6400, it's perfectly usable. It's noticeably noisy and grainy in spots at 6400, and I wouldn't go shooting a wedding at 6400, but it's usable, and you could certainly fix it in Lightroom later too. But compared to the 200, where it maxed out for my purposes at 800, this you can reasonably shoot at 6400 and for sure shoot at 3200. And this is, as of the time of this recording, this is probably the best or the second best crop sensor camera in terms of higher ISO performance that you can possibly buy, next to the Pentax K3. The answer, though, to the high ISO performance of this camera is, what are your needs as a photographer? Do you need the best possible high ISO performance? And if so, maybe crop sensor isn't the way to go. Maybe you invest in that 610 or that the 5D Mark III or whatever it might be, because you'll never get as good of high ISO performance on a crop sensor as you will on a full frame. It's just the laws of physics and how photons are, the energy from photons is collected by the chip in the camera. So what are your needs? If your primary need is higher ISO, this is probably not the way to go. But if you really like shooting at higher ISOs and have a lot of other needs that can be met by this camera, then this is probably a good one to consider. I'll say this, for every time shooting with this camera that I thought, man, it sure would be nice to have just a little better performance at 6400. For every time that's happened, there's been a dozen times when I'm glad I have this versus a different camera, even a 610 or 700. So take that as you will. Some other features of the camera. The auto ISO on this is very configurable. It's you can tie it into the aperture of whatever you're shooting at, and so it's configurable and customizable to meet your needs. I wouldn't let I set auto ISO in one of the user modes to go up to 3200, and I have no problems with that. I wouldn't set auto to go to 6400. I only do that on a case-by-case basis as I need to. But good auto ISO performance on this camera. Let's talk about some physical features. The giant screen on this is awesome. It's just over 3 inches, and I forget the dot count, like the pixel count. I think there's over 1 million dots on this screen, but it's fantastic. It's very useful, especially compared to my old D200, which just seems kind of minuscule in comparison. There's rich colors on this. It's really easy to tell if your photos are in focus when you start zooming in. And even in bright sunlight, it's easy to read. There's also it doesn't ship with the plastic cover. They make these screens pretty tough nowadays, and I decided I wasn't going to use a cover. Haven't thought about it since. It's not really an issue, but this big old screen in the back is awesome. You'll notice it's not articulating, which I'll talk a little bit about later, but the screen itself, the quality of the screen is phenomenal. I have no issues with the quality of the screen. What's next on my notes here? The top LCD screen here, I don't know how well this is going to show up in the video, but this top screen, this I really like compared to some of the lower models like the 3200, the 5200, or some other Canon models. This is like a nice little cheat sheet versus what's on the back here. So if you need to quickly look at what your shooting speed is, or what your aperture is, or what focusing mode you're in, or what your white balance is, if you're a JPEG shooter, that's the kind of stuff that is all over this top screen. It's really helpful to have that. I actually do, some features are missing compared to the D200, and I do miss that. You don't have your focus point selection on the top screen here, so you can't see which of the 51 points, the focus points, are being used. And there's no metering information on the top screen, so you can't look at this and decide and tell if you've properly metered your scene. So I missed that a little bit from the other camera, but it's not a deal breaker. That's all that's available on the back screen. You just push this info button here. I'm not going to push it because it's going to be blown out on the video. But if you push this info button, you'll see all of that information. It's like the screen, if you're used to it, 200, 300, or 700, pushing the info button gets all that information in really nice, easy to read, big old print on the back. So not really an issue, but just something that I do miss from the other camera. The two control dials, the front control dial and the back control dial, these are awesome, and this is one of the reasons I picked this camera. Once you have these control dials, it's hard to go back. and you can configure these to be to do a variety of things in the camera. If you don't have a camera with 2 control dials like this, in fact, the Canons I don't believe have dual control dials. Maybe some of them, the higher up ones do, but even like the 60D and the 70D, they just have the one. If you're a Nikon shooter, you've got a lower end Nikon, and maybe you're considering upgrading. Boy, it's nice to have these 2 control dials, and you can make them do a variety of things. It's just really nice to have them. They're really nice and firm. Again, with the build quality, these have nice hard clicks to them. They're rubberized control dials, so they feel really good in the hand. I wouldn't ever want to go back to a single control dial after using that D200, so I was really glad that the 7100 met that criteria. The mode dial versus the top button. Let me talk about that for a little bit. On this camera, it's a lot like others in the Nikon lineup, the 610, the 7000. This mode dial here is a little different than what I was used to on the 200. The 200 has the Nikon Trinity, your quality, white balance, and ISO. And if it allows you, just by pressing one of those and then the control dial, you can easily change the quality, so from RAW to JPEG and so on, or white balance or ISO. You can easily change that. This doesn't have that, and instead has this control dial. And some people see this and they think, well, it's a consumer camera. I don't want a consumer camera with a control dial. I want my 3 buttons. To be honest, the only one of those 3 buttons I ever used was ISO. I never used white balance or quality because I shoot in RAW. So of that top control dial, or the top buttons on the D200, I only used one of them anyway. And on this, I've actually got these control dials configured to handle ISO instead, so I don't even miss it. I like this control dial, and it's fantastic. I don't miss the one from the 200 at all. It's easy for me to visually tell which shooting mode I'm in and where I am in relation to others. There's a few other things about this control dial I'll get to in a little bit, but this also has a nice little locking button, and some people don't like this. I don't mind it. I think it works fine. I don't think you're ever going to accidentally bump this and turn it, but it is nice that you have to press this locking button down and then turn the dial. Nice solid clicks, good feel in the hands. And this secondary dial, the shooting mode dial, whether you're in single or continuous low, continuous high, this is good too. This is a lot like the 200 and some other cameras as well. So these control dials work very well. I find them very handy to use versus the 3 buttons on top of the 200. So no issues with that at all. The button placement all around in this camera, I find it to be very functional. You'll notice it's missing an AF on button here for back focusing. If you like back focusing, you can configure the AEL AFL button to be your AF on button, but then you lose this button, which you can then set to another button. So this doesn't have all the bells or all the buttons of some of the other cameras, but there's plenty of buttons here arranged just fine for your thumbs to reach them. And my only issue with that is this multi-selector switch is a little small. I wish it were a little bigger and easier to press what you want. Sometimes it's just a little small for me, but whatever. That's kind of nitpicking. Let's look at my notes here. The AF area on this, when you're focusing through the viewfinder, is massive. It doesn't go quite to the edge, but if you used a D300S, it's the same system as there, and I believe the 700 is the same system. It goes way out to the edge, and especially if you set it to the 1.3 crop mode on here, you'd have no problem. You never need to focus and recompose when you're using this camera. And if you're looking at this camera versus a different camera like a 5200 or a Canon like a Rebel T3i or T4i, this has way more focusing points that cover a huge range. The middle 3 rows are cross type, so you get even better focusing performance than that. It's lightning quick. You can focus instantly on whatever you have, on whatever you're framing up. So the AF area is fantastic, and that was a big concern for me. I wanted to be able to focus on whatever I pointed the camera at and not focus and recompose. So that was really useful for me to have that giant AF area, and it's very responsive. It's lightning fast. the customizable. This camera can be customized 10 ways from Sunday. I mean, you can configure the various buttons to do all kinds of different things. You can configure the OK button to do different things. I've got it set to when I press the OK button, it zooms in to the focused area of an image during playback. Or when I'm in shooting, pressing the OK resets my focusing point to the center. You can configure the function and the depth of field preview buttons to do different things. You can set the control dials to do different things. You can have a custom menu on here. There's customizable all over the place on this camera. So if that's something that you really like doing, this camera's got it. Don't let the fact that this might seem like a consumer grade camera fool you. This is not a consumer grade camera in terms of customizability. And speaking of customizations, the U1, U2 on here are phenomenal. If you haven't used a camera with user banks like this, wow, it's amazing once you do this. You don't ever want to go back. You can configure all the parameters of your camera, your file type, your ISO, your auto ISO, your shooting mode, your memory card functions, your movie settings, everything, and store them to user 1 and user 2. So when you pick up the camera in a given situation, you don't have to sit and configure everything. You can just switch it to user 1 or user 2, and all your settings are there. So if you find yourself shooting outdoors a lot and shooting in low light conditions indoors, you can have user 1 set how you like it for outdoor shooting and user 2 set how you like it for indoor shooting. And when you pick up the camera, it's half a second to just flip this dial to the mode you want. So it's super convenient, super easy to use. I wouldn't call this a deal breaker, but man, it's so nice to have this, the user 1 and user 2. Other cameras like the 200, the 300, there's other cameras that have user storage banks, but they're not as convenient to use. You got to dig through the menu and go to your custom menu settings and then select ABC or whatever it is. It's just not as easy to use. I never used it on my 200 because it was just so hard to drill down to those menus and do that. This user 1, user 2 is awesome. If you've never used it before, I encourage you to try this out. Find a camera with this and try it out. Interestingly, the Pentax K3, probably one of the closest rivals to this, next to the Canon 70D, that actually has 3 user selectable settings. So an advantage of that if you're deciding on the camera to get. Live view on this, it's good. I don't use it very much. I rarely use live view ever. I find it much easier to focus in the viewfinder, but it's really good. It's easy to focus and compose in the viewfinder. There's a lot of focusing options. There's face recognition. There's tracking. There's a lot of good stuff in live view. So if you're the kind of person who likes shooting in live view, this has got you covered. The movie mode though is good, but it's not really much use to me. I don't really shoot movies in my camera like this. So yeah, it's got 1080i. It's got when I do shoot movies, I shoot in 720p and 60 frames a second. The focusing is not as good as something like a Canon 70D. If you're a movie shooter, I would check out the Canon 70D. It's the what do they call it? The dual pixel something. They have a focusing system on there combined with the touch screen of the Canon 70D that makes it a lot more practical for video shooters. It's great if you buy a camera primarily for photos, but you also like shooting video. This is fine. You can hook up a microphone. You can monitor your levels with a headphone jack, or there's a visual readout of the levels on your audio levels here on the screen. You can adjust the aperture. So if you're shooting a scene at f4 and you decide you want a little less depth of field, you want to adjust it to f5.6 or f8, you have to get out of live view, adjust it, and then go back to live view. So again, don't buy this for movies, but if you buy it for photos and also like movies, then there you go. There's a ton of other little refinements on this camera. And sometimes I'll just pick it up and start shooting and just be amazed at the little refinements. There's dual memory card slots. So if you want to set one to be a RAW and one JPEG if you want to duplicate all your photos in case your memory card dies on you. There's a lot of versatility when you have the dual memory card slots. There's a long battery life. I think it's rated for like 900 shots, so you can go all day on a battery. There's the 1.3x crop mode, which essentially, I've got it configured to this function button down here, I believe. I forget which button. But if you want to just basically extend the reach of your lens by 1.3x, you can enable the crop mode, and it uses then only the center portion of the frame to compose the shot and take the shot. And then your AF area extends literally to the edge of the frame. So that's handy if you're a wildlife shooter and you really want some extra reach. It's got this I button down at the bottom for custom or for common settings on the camera. There's extensive menus to drill into it and get to every little function of the camera. There's intervalometer on here. I think that's really handy. It's a great feature that's often overlooked on these Nikon cameras. For instance, Christmas time, set this intervalometer, take a picture set the intervalometer on this to take a picture every 20 seconds, set it in the corner, and walk away from it. Then after you're done opening presents, you come back and you've got 150, 250 good shots, shots, and then you find the good ones. But there's a lot of useful situations for an intervalometer that you might not think of initially. So that's something to consider. There's a virtual horizon on here. It'll tell you if it's level. I mean, there's just tons of really good refinements where you pick this up and you just know this is designed for people who really like the experience of shooting photos and they don't want the camera to get in the way. There's also, finally, there's no low pass filter, optical low pass filter. They eliminated that on this camera. What that means is, in theory, your images are going to be even sharper than on like a D7000. I don't know. To me, I can't tell a difference. If you're the kind of guy who likes to investigate that, there's plenty of information online, but that's neither here nor there for me. The images are sharp. That's what matters to me. Let's talk about some of the drawbacks of this camera. The burst mode on here, if you set it to continuous high, it shoots at, I believe, 5 or 6 frames a second, depending on what crop mode you're in. It's limited to about 5 or 6 frames because then the buffer fills up, the internal buffer, before it starts writing to the memory card. That means if you're a sports photographer and you're tracking the quarterback as he runs the whole play, or you're tracking the running back as he's running down the field, you're going to run out of room on your buffer. The 200, the 300, the 700, there's other cameras, or the D800 obviously, that can go all day. They can go for a full 5-10 seconds before filling up that buffer. This is not that camera. So if that's really a concern for you, maybe take that into account when buying this. It's not an issue for me. I've never ever had an issue where I've needed more than like 4 or 5 shots in a row of high-speed shooting. There's no articulating screen, like I mentioned earlier. If that's something, if you find yourself using live view and you want to look down as you compose your shot, then you're going to be a little frustrated with this. Again, that's never been an issue for me. I can't think of a time when I've found myself in a situation where I wished any camera I owned had an articulating screen, but some people like it. It's not a touchscreen either. Again, some people like that. I find touchscreens on DSLRs to be a little gimmicky, but that's just me. The T4i, the Canon T4i, nice touchscreen. So if you're looking for that, this is not your camera. There's some quirks in live view. I don't use live view anyway. And these 2 buttons here, the preview, the depth of field preview, and the function button, they're a little awkwardly placed, so it's hard to reach them sometimes. But honestly, there's so many good things about this camera that you really find yourself nitpicking to point out the bad things. And I don't say that just because I spent money on this camera and I want to justify the purchase. I say it because it's a really solid camera. This is seriously one of the best crop sensor cameras you can buy, period. My conclusion to all this is I highly recommend this camera, but only if you're serious about your photos. It's not meant really for people who shoot in auto. It's got an auto mode, but don't buy this if you're just getting into photography. I would buy a lower-end camera. I'd buy a 3200 or a 5100 or a 5200. I'd buy something else, a T3i. Pick up one of those. They're all good cameras. Like I said earlier, if your photos are turning out bad, chances are it's not the camera's fault. Chances are I don't want to say it's your fault, but there's other factors at play. Maybe your composition isn't as good, or your sense of lighting isn't as good, or other things than that. The camera is probably not the limiting factor here. But this is not really, you could buy this and shoot in auto, but you're kind of wasting the camera. And you could say, well, I'm going to buy this and learn. Well, that's certainly something you could do. But you could also buy a lower end camera for $300-400 and learn, and then decide if this really does fit your needs. Maybe this doesn't fit your needs once you figure out what your needs are. I would buy a lower end camera and then buy lenses, and then figure out if you really do need this camera or not. The advantage of this is features, bells and whistles, and these are very important bells and whistles for me, not necessarily image quality. Image quality is about as good as it gets for crop sensor, but if you're if you're just getting started in photography, a lower end camera won't have all the features, but it will have just fine image quality for you. There's a few issues, like I mentioned, but they're not worth quibbling over. No camera's perfect. Would I upgrade to this camera if I had a D7000? Probably not. I'd probably keep the D7000 and wait for something else to come down the line. Maybe that rumored D400 they keep talking about. If your camera's 3 or 4 years old and you're really looking for better ISO performance or some different features like user 1, user 2, or a bigger screen, if there's a concrete feature you like about this camera, sure, go ahead and upgrade. You'll like it, and this will never be a bad choice for you. But it's just a matter of, can you spend your money on something else versus a new camera body? Is a new camera body really the limiting factor? In my case, it was. In your case, it might not be. Let's talk about some other cameras. We've already talked about other cameras. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I like the buttons, the menus, the controls on this, hence this camera, and it suits me quite well. The weather sealing, the focus motor, there's an internal focus motor for older Nikon lenses. These are all factors that you can consider, but this is not necessarily the right camera for everybody. Maybe you like travel photography, and you're backpacking through Appalachian Mountains or something. I wouldn't even get a DSLR. I'd get a mirrorless, a Micro Four Thirds or something like that. You get the Olympus OMD EM1 or the Fuji X Pro 1. You'll get image quality just about on par with this at a camera this big. So again, it's all about what your needs are. Finally, should you wait for a future camera like the D400 I mentioned? I don't know. You can wait all day, and once that comes out, maybe you'll want to wait for the D500. I don't know. But if you had to make the choice today, if you're in a position to upgrade or a position to look for a different camera, I would recommend this camera if you're looking for some of the qualities that it has. So this is an outstanding camera. I hope this review was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. I'd be happy to answer them. And if you need image samples, if you want to request specific photos that I take with this so you can judge for yourself, I'd be happy to provide that. Otherwise, you can do plenty of Googling. There's tons of other people who've done that same thing. So there you go, your review of the D7100. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.